So I'm Dr. Andrew Freeman from National Jewish in Denver, and I am going to talk today about the year in plants. And what I do every year, for those of you that have not seen me speak, is I actually comb through the data and try to pull out what I think are the best studies that were done on nutrition and lifestyle in the last year. And many of you might be surprised to see, here I have, 80 some odd slides, and that's only a small portion of what was actually published. There is an enormous body of evidence and literature every year that pours in and really supports the practice of what we do, which is using nutrition in improving health outcomes every day. And because most of my colleagues, unfortunately, are not trained in this, including me, we really don't pay attention to it, sadly. So I'm hoping to raise awareness and get you excited about using nutrition in your everyday lives. I also want to point out, as I do every year, that it's impossible to do a nutrition study without imprisoning people and ensuring nutritional intake. And many of the studies are observational and don't show cause, but of course there's a relationship, right? We'd have to force feed people, and most people would not want to do that. I also want to point out that, years ago when I started doing this, probably nearly a decade ago, I definitely stood out. People would kind of think I was a strange bird, so to speak. And it's starting to become mainstream, but people still would tell you, oh, that's the vegan guy as my first description, rather than, oh, that guy's a very good cardiologist or a nice guy or whatever. So, and I also want to just put this out. I always talk about this all the time. People ask all the time, where are you getting your protein from? Remember that all of life is made out of protein, and gorillas and elephants are busy eating leaves all day long and doing just fine getting all the protein they need, right? When we eat animals, we take a shortcut and we get all the protein that they have made with a bunch of the bad stuff that we don't want. And of course, many of these are sentient beings, which is a whole nother issue. But I would point out that pound for pound, green leafy vegetables have as much or more protein than the vast majority of quote unquote proteins in the forms of steak, chicken, or eggs, or other things that we eat. I also want to point out that years ago, it was certainly commonplace for doctors to smoke. In fact, doctors would tell other people that they smoke to improve their health, which of course sounds completely backwards in today's world, almost as backward as when a doctor says, I need to eat red meat. And of course, it wouldn't be the 2020s if we didn't notice that everybody around us is incredibly sick and the obesity rates are through the roof. In fact, in 2017, 2018, obesity, not just overweight, was at 42%. Prevalence of obesity and severe obesity was the highest in non-Hispanic Black adults. And about 60% of non-Hispanic Black women were obese. So again, there is a socioeconomic divide, a disparity that's been developed, in addition to a countrywide prevalence that is just incredible. And we are going to be seeing an enormous increase in this as time goes on. It also matters what we eat earlier in life. This was a really interesting study, and this was summarized in the Wall Street Journal, believe it or not. So you can imagine that these are hitting the mainstream media. And there's a critical window when kids are young, between 6 and 12 months of old, when they may be most receptive to new foods, including bitter ones like greens. And scientists have discovered that influence occurs even earlier. Babies that are exposed to this in mother's milk and through amniotic fluid actually seem to enjoy these foods later in life. So we really need to be eating well through our pregnancies and beyond, and early in life. In fact, up to 99% of children and adolescents eat less than the recommended amount of vegetables. About half of children are eating less than the recommended amount of fruit per day. And only 6% of babies are eating dark green vegetables any given day. I actually thought it was going to be less than that, believe it or not. We also know that high blood pressure is also on the rise, right? Something like 50% of Americans have heart disease, according to the AHA, and most of that is hypertension. And it turns out that we are seeing increases, and you can see that in certain regions, particularly the South, right, the rural South in particular, where the stroke belt is, blood pressure is going up and death rates are also going up. So we know the Southern diet has been proven multiple times now to be a killer. We really need to make some changes. In this study of 4,700 men and women from Japan, China, the United Kingdom, and the United States, it was Intermap. If they followed a healthy plant-based diet, blood pressure dropped by about a point. But if they followed an unhealthy plant-based diet, it actually increased. So I always point out that blood pressure is important, and even a millimeter change in a large population can actually significantly improve outcomes. But it's important to note that we're finding that if you're a junk food plant-based eater, i.e. potato chips, Coca-Cola, Oreo cookies, you actually can harm yourself regularly. So don't do that. We also know that amongst African Americans that there is a higher risk, as I mentioned already. And this was an interesting study published again in the AHA. 5 weeks of a plant-based nutrition intervention where 44 volunteers committed to eating only home delivery. And they actually dropped their risk significantly and dropped their cholesterol as well. And adherence to this diet was an amazing 93%. And I would tell you that if you can sort of hold the hand of people and get them to eat plant-based foods, they'll find that they're actually quite nutritious. If you want a lower body mass index, this is proven time and time again, that compared to animal-derived products with animal-derived products and animal-derived meals, body mass index and other health markers improve, and they stay improved for the long term. Also, there's been lots more diet wars over the last little bit. This was an interesting study, a small one. People were randomized to either a low-fat vegan diet or a low-carbohydrate diet for 2 weeks and then switched to the other diet for 2 weeks. And it turns out that people, in whatever order they were on, consumed 700 fewer daily calories on a low-fat plant-based diet when compared to the low-carb diet alone. And there were no differences in satiety. Both groups lost weight, but the low-fat diet actually reduced body fat percentages. So there's something pretty amazing about a mostly plant-based diet. This was an interesting study from Tehran, about 5,000 participants. Those who consume the most red and processed meat increased their risk for chronic kidney disease by 73% and up to 99% with the processed meat. And if they swapped just one serving of red or processed meat with a serving of legumes or grains, they lowered the risk for disease by up to 30%. And I'll point out that CKD and plant-based diets are an emerging topic. This was a really neat study from 2020 from the American Journal of Kidney Diseases. And basically they said that issues with a plant-based diet in the renal population may not have been as significant as previously thought, and the advantages are quite vast. In conclusion, the risk to benefit ratio of plant-based diet appears to be in favor of their more prevalent use. There's always a concern about phosphorus and potassium, but turns out that many of the foods that people are eating that are quote unquote lower in potassium or phosphorus may actually be harming them more. This was another study also published that says plant-based diets to manage the risks and complications of kidney disease in Nature. And what it showed was that plant-based diets have a low acid load, which could mitigate some of the metabolic acidosis that's seen in this population. Plant phosphorus is bound and less bioavailable than that found in animal phosphorus. And the restriction of plant foods as a strategy to prevent hyperkalemia deprives patients with CKD of the potential beneficial effects of these foods. And plants with lower potassium content provide choice for those who do need to restrict their potassium intake. So you've probably seen olive oil and other oils constantly in the news these days. This was an interesting study that was published in JACC, and it replaced 5 grams of margarine, butter, or mayonnaise with the same amount of olive oil, and that actually lowered risk of coronary disease by 7%. This was followed, they followed 62,000 women from the Nurses' Health Study, 32,000 men from the Health Professional Study, and there were no significant associations that were noted when olive oil was compared with other plant oils combined. So olive oil may be the best oil. And I talk a lot about this. In general, oils may not be the most beneficial to many people with coronary disease, especially with adding fat, but olive oil is a unique type of oil because you can really just squeeze the olive and oil comes out, whereas the vast majority of other oils require high pressure and heat just to extract the oil. This was another interesting study here of about 37,000 Americans. Those who ate the most plant protein were about 27% less likely to die from any cause, and 29% less likely to die from heart disease. And if you replace just 5% of the calories from animal protein with an equal number of calories from plant protein, you had half the risk of dying from any cause, including heart disease. And just 2% of processed meat with plant protein was 32% less death. So what I want to point out here is these are very huge numbers with very small changes, 5% of calories, 2% of calories. So you can imagine the benefits if we were to change 100% of calories. So strokes in women have been discussed frequently over the last couple of years, particularly in association with sugar-sweetened beverages and other things. But this was an interesting study here of about 60,000 women. And they did an estimate of 26-year risk with no lifestyle interventions. They came up with about 5% for total stroke and other types of stroke as well. With exercise, not smoking, weight loss, this risk went down to 3.5%, and the other types of stroke went down as well. Lifestyle modifications were estimated to reduce the 26-year risk of total stroke by a quarter, and ischemic stroke, which is a type of stroke when there are blood supply issues by 36%. And sustained dietary modifications, meaning eating better, were estimated to reduce their total risk of stroke by 23%. So this was out of the British Medical Journal. You may have seen this. What do we know and what's the way forward here? And it turns out that obesity and alcohol increase the risk for several types of cancer. For colorectal cancer, processed meat, of course, increases the risk, and red meat probably increases the risk, whereas fiber and calcium reduce the risk. Foods containing mutagens, which are foods that you can find from very well done meats, salted fish, and foods contaminated with aflatoxin cause liver cancer. Fruits and vegetables are not clearly linked to cancer risk, although low intakes can certainly help link to certain types of cancers. And other nutritional factors might contribute to the risk of cancer, but the evidence is not strong enough. So again, a powerful message reinforcing that we need to eat more fruits and vegetables. How about diabetes? So we've seen over the last couple of years that the ADA has moved fully in favor of a plant-based diet, as have most professional societies endorsing this as a helpful approach. So this was an interesting study that looked at 28 different manuscripts. Those who consume the most meat, red meat, and processed meat increased the risk for diabetes by 33%, 22%, or up to 25%. And if they had an extra 100 grams per day, the risk went up by 36% and 31% respectively. An extra 50 grams of processed meat increased the risk for diabetes by 46%. And this has actually been shown multiple times in the literature over the years. You know, just a couple slices of bacon can actually significantly increase the risk for both cancer and diabetes. This was another study from the EPIC cohort, about 10,000 participants with type 2 diabetes and about 14,000 others. And those who ate the most fruit or vegetables reduced the risk for diabetes by 50%. 66 grams per day more fruit and vegetables are associated with a 25% lower risk of diabetes. That's like having just an extra apple or so. You've probably heard me talk before about eggs and diabetes. There is a lot of published data in this space that show a very strong association with egg intake and the development of diabetes. This was an interesting one where they compared egg consumption with blood glucose levels in 8,500 participants. One or more eggs per day increases the risk of diabetes by 30%, and more eggs lead to more diabetes. This was another one here, and I mentioned just a little bit ago about cooked meat leading to glycogen end products, which can actually increase risks of cancer. But these researchers compared a diet high in red and processed meat. They tracked the levels of these advanced glycogen end products by roasting or broiling or frying meats. And those who ate the red and processed meat increased their concentrations of a couple of the bad ones and a compound associated with disease progression when compared to those who followed the diet with no meat. We also know that carbs are important, but they need to be the good carbs. We've got to get rid of the garbage, right? Garbage carbs. So in the Nurses Health Study, again, followed up about 4.7 million person years, 18,000 participants with diabetes were identified. Those who ate the most whole grains, including whole grain cereal, oatmeal, dark bread, brown rice, had a 29% reduced diabetes risk compared with those who ate the lowest amount of whole grains. Now, you've seen me talk about sodas over the last couple of years. It turns out that sugar-sweetened beverages are harmful and artificially sweetened beverages are harmful. Remember that the perfect beverage for human consumption remains to be water. So 104,000 participants followed for 10 years. If they consumed sugar-sweetened beverages, they had 20% more cardiovascular disease risk. Artificially sweetened beverages, 32% more risk. The authors said that higher intakes of sugary drinks and artificially sweetened beverages were associated with a higher risk of heart disease, saying that we shouldn't really make these substitutions. So for those of us addicted to Diet Coke, which I know many of us are, we really have to try to break that habit. This was an interesting study here. This was the same study here. This is the interesting table from the study. So basically anything on the right side of the chart between 1 and 2 means that there's harm. You can see that non-consumers had no harm. They were right at 1, but everybody else, lower consumers, higher consumers of either sugary drinks or artificially sweetened beverages, those are the red and blue, were in trouble. So try your best to get rid of them. And believe it or not, the much maligned potato turns out to be quite a friendly food for us. So this was a study of diabetics. They ate 1 of 4 experimental dinners, including potatoes prepared multiple ways, versus a dinner with just rice. Blood sugar was checked before, after, and at 30-minute intervals. No difference in glucose response, but the overnight glucose response was more controlled after a potato dinner than the rice meal. So interestingly, you may see that cardioobstetrics is a new field that is rapidly growing. And then this is an interesting study here where they took a dietary intake scored according to the Healthful Plant-Based Diet Index, HPDI. And the analysis showed a strong inverse association between plant-based diet and gestational diabetes, with a 30% reduced risk in the highest quintile versus the lowest. And the researchers also identified a 30% lower risk of gestational diabetes for every 10-point increase in eating well on the Healthy Plant-Based Diet Index. And we know that gestational diabetes sets women up later in life for either diabetes or other cardiovascular risk. How about cinnamon? This has been in the news for a long time. This was a small study. Those who consumed 500 milligrams per day, those who took the cinnamon supplement actually had much more stable blood sugar levels and modest drops in A1C, which is a measure of glucose over the last 3 months. And who doesn't like to die less? So this was another study from the NIH AARP Diet and Health Study. Replacing just 3% of animal protein with plant-based protein, especially with good carbs, reduced the risk of death from heart disease by up to 12%. Overall death risk dropped by 10%. And these associations were strongest when it came to replacing protein from eggs and red meat with plant protein, up to a quarter less risk of dying. There's another one, 32 prospective cohort studies were followed, and 31 in the meta-analysis. Higher intake of total protein seems to be less good for us, but higher intake of total protein appears to be better for us, but higher intake of plant protein is significantly associated with an 8% lower risk of dying overall and 22% less cardiovascular disease mortality. So it's important to take in some protein, and when you do take in that protein, it should be plant-based protein in an effort to reduce overall cardiovascular risk. And remember that those of you that have heard me talk, I always tell you that the root cause for virtually every disease we take care of is inflammation. And if we can cut the inflammation, many times the disease halts or even if we're lucky, reverses. So in 75,000 participants, diets with the most pro-inflammatory foods, such as red and processed meat, you can see enormously higher risk for heart disease and stroke when compared to those who followed diets with more anti-inflammatory foods, such as green leafy vegetables, yellow and whole grains. So this is also interesting. You may have seen in the pandemic year that there's actually an enormous risk for those that are obese. And it turns out that when we are following a better diet and staying thinner and exercising more, our susceptibility to COVID goes down. And obesity is linked to all the different risk factors that make people more susceptible to COVID. It also says here that COVID-19 outbreaks and meat packing plants have focused minds on the meat industry as a driver for acute and chronic disease. Remember that the COVID virus is thought to have come from an open-air meat market in China. Last month, Monique Tan and colleagues wrote that the food industry should be held partly accountable, not only for the obesity pandemic, but for the severity of COVID-19 disease and its devastating consequences. So the government needs to do more. And I invite you, if you are ever strong enough stomached, to look into what has been reported with investigative reporters in meatpacking plants, and I think you might never eat there again. How about for asthma? So this was an interesting one. I work at a respiratory hospital. There's actually been enormous amounts of data published in the asthma space and plant-based diets. But this is a new review and links asthma to nutrition. No surprise. Asthma seems to be on the rise as people are getting heavier and as we're eating more fat. Diets that emphasize fruits, vegetables, grains, and legumes, minimize saturated fat, reduce the risk for asthma, probably because they're anti-inflammatory, and dairy seems to be a huge linker. The good news for us is that coffee is good for us. And believe it or not, in this study, they showed that people who drank coffee regularly were actually less likely to have an arrhythmia, which has always been a concern. But of course, if you're sensitive, you should avoid it and certainly check in with your doctor. This was a really neat study of 5,000 patients from Japan. Drinking a cup of green tea every day dropped mortality by 15%. 2 to 3 cups was even better, and 4 cups was even better. And if you had coffee a cup a day, 12% lower risk mortality, 2 plus 41% a reduction. And if you did both, you got up to a 63% lower death for 4 cups of green tea and 2 cups of coffee every day. You could also argue that if you have time to drink that much coffee, maybe with a friend or two, maybe you're not working or you're very independently wealthy, and maybe that's why you live longer, who knows? But nevertheless, good data. And of course, there's been lots of data over the years published about cancer in coffee. It turns out that if you drink up to 9 cups of coffee per day, you had a 9% lower risk of developing prostate cancer. And if you can drink these flavonols, and remember these come from berries and other antioxidant-rich foods like coffee beans and chocolate, etc., blood pressure actually can drop. So in this study of about 26,000 participants, if you had the lowest 10% of flavanol intake, your blood pressure was higher. and in those who consume the most, blood pressure dropped up to 4 millimeters of mercury. And this is actually what you can see in the DASH diet or a Mediterranean diet. And we need to start making sure people are increasing these in their everyday consumption. We also know that people who consume berries regularly actually were 40% less likely to develop dementia. And then following the DASH trial, DASH is Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension. It's a predominantly plant-based diet. And they followed these people for a while. And it turns out that 8 weeks of monitored feeding with either a controlled diet, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, but similar to the control diet, or the DASH diet was followed. And it turns out that compared with the control diet, the fruit and vegetable diet reduced troponin levels, which is a marker of kidney injury, and another one called NT-proBNP, which is another marker of adverse outcomes in heart disease. And then compared with the control diet, the DASH diet also did this. None of the markers differ between the fruit and vegetable and DASH diet. So bottom line is what you're seeing here is the standard American diet continues to hurt people. And no matter what we check, biomarkers for heart disease or blood pressure or obesity or whatever, it turns out that a rich diet in fruits and vegetables always seems to make everybody do better. How about sushi, right? Everyone loves sushi. Well, this study came out this last year. It turns out that if you eat sushi regularly, you have 283 times more parasites than in the 1960s. And it may increase the risk for a very rare condition, which is becoming more prevalent, called anisakidosis. So maybe go out for veggie sushi, which I would argue is equally good. This was another study, again, from the Nurses' Health Study. Isoflavone from soy was found to be inversely associated with heart disease. If you compare the extreme quintiles, 13% less heart disease. Consumption of tofu in this study, but not soy milk, inversely associated with heart disease, up to 18% less. How about with dementia? Well, it turns out that when you consume soy, your gut produces a metabolite called equal. And it turns out that this has been correlated with, by MRI, with less dementia. So those who produce the most equal actually have 50% fewer lesions in their brain. This was a really great study that I had the fortunate ability to contribute with my colleagues. And we talked a lot about disparities in the United States. And it turns out that we need to call on public health policy to address these disparities to reduce poor health outcomes in underserved populations, increasing access to healthful foods, and disincentivizing low quality food purchases. As you may know, one of the highest things that's consumed on food stamps is actually soda and sugar sweetened beverages. So we need to make some changes. We also need to start eating well regularly. So in this particular study that was done, this was from 2001 to 2012, following about 3,000 folks. Healthful and unhealthful plant-based dietary indices were followed. It turns out that those with the highest healthful plant-based pattern were significantly protected against cardiovascular disease and a bit stronger in women, believe it or not. And it also turns out that we need to be consuming more cruciferous vegetables. It turns out cauliflower popularity is actually on the rise, which is great. It is an incredibly versatile vegetable to cook with. Having gone to medical school in Buffalo, I am a huge fan of the buffalo cauliflower wing, which is surprisingly close to the real thing. But in this study of folks in Western Australia, women in this study who consumed more than 45 grams of cruciferous vegetables had 46% less aortic calcification or atherosclerosis. And it strengthens the hypothesis that cruciferous vegetables protect against vascular calcification. This is a really interesting study. So what they did is, this was a single site study, by the way. They instructed participants to consume 2 servings of plant-based meats compared with animal-based meats for 8 weeks each, keeping all the other foods that they ate constant. And believe it or not, even with the relatively high fat and less healthy plant-based meats, LDL, weight, and something called TMAO, transmethylamine oxide, which is a byproduct of our gut flora, which is associated with heart failure and stroke, from Stanley Hazen's lab in the Cleveland Clinic, all dropped. So if you're going to have to eat some sort of a meat product, consider eating one of these plant-based meats, which are really quite tasty, but I would tell you surprisingly unhealthful at this point in time. How about breast cancer and fiber? So this was a really interesting study, and I've talked at length about breast cancer in my prior talks. This was a 19-study analysis, and those who consumed the most fiber had an 8% reduced risk for premenopausal and postmenopausal cancer when compared with those who had the least fiber. Soluble fiber from cereal, fruit, legumes, and vegetables showed strongest associations. How about with dairy? So in this study of about 53,000 North American women, dietary intakes from food frequency questionnaires were followed. And it turns out that higher intakes of dairy were associated with breast cancer up to a 22 to 50% higher risk. Full fat and reduced fat milks also had similar results. But if you substitute the immediate intake of dairy milk users by those of soy milk consumers, you could drop your risk by 32%. How about prostate cancer? Again, lots of interesting data over the years with eggs and dairy and prostate cancer. But in this study, about 1,900 cases of prostate cancer were followed. Those who had the healthiest diet, 24% less risk. And those who had the healthiest diets had a 44% less high-grade prostate cancer risk. You may have seen from the American Cancer Society, they released these new guidelines for cancer prevention, and they recommended increasing plant-based foods, excluding or limiting red and processed meat, and highlighted physical activity. And I guess I would point out that over the years, many of the cancer societies and organizations in the United States have fully endorsed the plant-based diet because it is truly anti-cancer. Remember that after heart disease, the number 2 killer in the country is cancer, and they do share a lot of common pathophysiology or the reasons behind their disease. How about testosterone? So diet records for 191 participants were tracked. Food frequency questionnaires were also looked at. And it turns out that men do not need to consume meat or other animal products to maintain their normal testosterone. So for all of you men out there said that you're going to turn into a woman or you're unmanly to not eat meat, I would tell you there's zero data to support that. And if we want to age gracefully, we really also should consume a more plant-based diet. In this study, it turns out that plant-based diets overall can reduce the risk of the top non-communicable diseases, diabetes, cancer, heart disease, by up to 50%. And that blue zones were particularly called out. These are parts of the United States and the world where people live longer. The only one in the United States is in Loma Linda, California, home of the Seventh-day Adventists, which is part of their religion, follow a plant-based diet. So no surprise there. BMJ, over the last couple of years, the British Medical Journal has been publishing an enormous amount of data about nutrition and environment on our health. And in this study, they said of over 500,000 adults, it turns out that those with a better dietary index score with a higher dietary index score suggesting a worse diet had increased risk of all-cause mortality from cancer, higher disease 4% more, heart disease 4% more, respiratory diseases up to 40% more, and digestive diseases up to 1/4 more. So really matters what we eat. So you may have seen this. This was a big controversy. So in the Annals of Internal Medicine, there was this Nutra-Rex consortium that published data that basically suggested that they should continue your current unprocessed red meat consumption, but there was a weak recommendation and low certainty evidence. And of course, the media misconstrued this very much. And the panel said that you can continue current processed meat consumption. If you read the article carefully, it actually, none of their data supports this. In fact, there's no data at all to support this. But they said, well, if you're eating not very much, you might as well just continue because we're not sure it makes a difference. I would tell you that there's plenty of data to suggest otherwise. You may have seen this also, that there was a reassessment of saturated fat. And they said here, foods with a complex matrix that are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And the totality of evidence does not support limiting intake of such foods. This was a very criticized article, and many of the authors in both of these articles were funded by the beef industry, believe it or not, which unfortunately this one slipped through the filter. So you may have seen this really nice outcry that was put out in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, which said recent publications about red and processed meat suggest that we as a nutrition community still have a long way to go. The stakes are high, chronic diseases are preventable. We have a responsibility and a duty to publish better. And the recent reports on red and processed meat fell short on several of these points. And then you may have seen this. This was in Frontiers in Nutrition. This was an editorial. It said the assembly of papers collected, which they put together, highlights the direct health benefits of a well-practiced vegetarianism with indirect benefits on aquifers, ecosystems, fire, floods, and droughts, perhaps even more salient. Last year, you may have seen that the Lancet in the United Kingdom and Europe actually had an entire discussion about the environment and made a very strong plea, as did the New England Journal of Medicine and Nature, to switch to a predominantly plant-based diet for the future of our environment. This was in Circulation. This was a study about economic impacts of national menu calorie labeling. And they said that basically if they did this, it would require industry to reformulate their menu items to potentially improve benefits. I think if we knew how much we were eating when we went out to dinner, it would blow your mind. And in fact, there's a wonderful periodical put out called Nutrition Action, which highlights this, and I highly recommend you subscribe. And And in this study, this was an interesting one here. They looked at brain activity and satiety in diabetics. And when people consumed a meal with meat, they had decreased secretion of a hormone that affects reward circuits. But when they consumed a plant-based meal, they were more satisfied and had better blood flow in the regions of the brain that were associated with food intake. So there may be something at a brain level that says that we feel better when we eat this way. And this was an interesting one. I talk a lot about stress and mindfulness. And in this particular study of folks with heart failure, they completed a daily assessment of perceived stress, anger, and negative emotion, followed by a laboratory mental stress protocol. And 14 patients experienced stress-induced increases in diastolic dysfunction. So basically, their heart got stiffer as they were stressed out. No surprise there. How about erectile dysfunction? Greater than 20,000 men, 22% decrease in the risk of erectile dysfunction in those who consume the healthiest diets. In this particular study, which was published in JAMA, a more Mediterranean diet, which is a predominantly plant-based diet. In this study of 43,000 men from the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, over 1 million person years of follow-up, 1 serving per day of plant protein sources of nuts, legumes, and soy lowered heart disease risk by 14%. And this was in the British Medical Journal. So you can see time and time again, the same theme seems to emerge. And when we make these swaps and changes towards a healthier diet, our risk for heart disease drops. Avoid the fries. So in this particular study, most fried food compared to the least 28% greater risk of major cardiovascular event like heart attack, up to a 37% risk of heart failure. And each risk substantially increased by just a weekly 4-ounce serving, which is a small French fry. How about weight? So the intervention group here of 244 participants, they were asked to follow a low-fat vegan diet. Body weight decreased in the intervention group by 6 kilograms, which is like 14 pounds or so, and liver fat dropped significantly, which is a big risk factor for diabetes. But of course, you can't just eat right and sit on the couch. You got to exercise. But in this study, just 11 minutes a day seemed to be helpful. If you got 11 minutes of moderate to vigorous exercise a day, you were less likely to die. 34 minutes per day attenuated the association between a sedentary lifestyle and the risk of death. We also know from this study of 37,000 participants that when they completed a VO2 max test, those exercising up to 2 times a week and more than 3 times a week had a significant reduction in depression and anxiety. Especially in the era of COVID, I've always encouraged my patients to go exercise outside, sometimes without other people for social distancing. And then we also know that all this theories about being fit but fat, it turns out probably not really true. Our study suggests that although physical activity partly mitigates the detrimental effects of being overweight, all this overweight also significantly increases major risk factors up to 5-fold higher odds for high cholesterol, blood pressure. So we really need to try to get the weight down and the fitness up. This was a really interesting study, which was published in Wired magazine. And what they did is they actually showed the technology and how a very tech-savvy individual was able to go into a pig farm and reveal what went on there. And boy, it is an interesting one. So definitely check this one out. And a tip from a whistleblower that a pig farm in Iowa was about to attempt a ventilation shutdown, which is a process where large clusters of livestock are killed by suffocating them, was revealed by this particular mechanism. So we're hitting on all the mainstream media these days. And here's an interesting one from a lifestyle standpoint. So if you're diabetic, maybe get a hot tub. If you have more than 4 baths a week, you're actually likely to weigh less and have less severe diabetes. How about that? Or interestingly, if you are diabetic and you have a dog, you're more likely that if you're diabetic, your dog will be diabetic and vice versa. So maybe feed your dog better and exercise more. Or even better, try to keep your spouse healthy. This was an interesting one. And I always talk about the connectedness to other people, how important it is. But those with a spouse in the ICU had an increased odds of having a heart attack themselves and a higher risk of being hospitalized. And people with a spouse in the ICU were more likely to be diagnosed with high blood pressure, diabetes, and high cholesterol. And if you're worried about the Earth's future, it turns out that we may actually be in worse shape, believe it or not, than we even thought. Essentially, humans have created an ecological Ponzi scheme, according to these folks. Consumption as a percentage of Earth's capacity to regenerate itself has grown from 73% to more than 170% today. But there are some good things in the horizon. So plant-based products are infiltrating fast food. Of course, you don't want to eat a plant-based burger covered with cheese and mayo. And believe it or not, Beyond Meat is going to launch a couple of versions of its meatless burger that are actually healthy. Remember that plant-based meats these days, as tasty as they are and as good as they are, and as likely that you will think they are real meat, they are super duper high in fat. And we continue to show folks doing intensive cardiac rehabilitation, which is a program across the country. We do one at National Jewish at Denver, and there are some all over the place. But basically, it's a program that you have to be sick to get into. And if you follow these people over time, the vast majority of people seem to stop or reverse their heart disease, drop their cholesterol, improve coronary blood flow, adhere to the program, and of course, do better. And it's really a 9-week program where people learn how to eat, live, exercise, and de-stress and connect with others. Just to show you some of the outcomes on a national level, you can see weight loss, body mass index, cholesterol drops 20%, blood pressure drops of 6%, diabetes down 6%, depression down way almost 50%. But also beware of the junk. When you check the label here and it's vegan, you always see people really saying, oh boy, let's eat it. But there's a lot of plant-based foods these days that are good tasting, but not good for you. So success is a 100% whole grain, minimally processed plant-based diet. Albert Einstein would agree that nothing will benefit human health and increase our chances for survival as the evolution to a vegetarian diet. And I encourage you to check out some of the programs I do, like Walk with a Doc, which is a national program. And we even have a transitioning to plant-based support group that's done by Zoom. So patients from all over the country or the world, for that matter, can certainly tune in. And if you're not convinced, I always encourage people to do your own research and learn on your own, because when you see the data, you will be blown away. And with that, I'll take some questions.
Well, you're amazing. That was absolutely incredible. And if I wasn't already plant nutritious, I would be starting yesterday. So yeah. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, and also being on the board of Shape Up Us and helping us to change the planet. You know, it is just an incredible, it's funny because I eat a potato a day, and I also wrote a book on satiety foods that fill you up, and they're pretty much all plant nutritious. So it's everything that you stated. My question, with your patients, what would be the percentage that actually change their nutrition and their lifestyle?
Yeah, so I incorporate nutrition into every visit that I do with my patients. And I think that's an important thing that we should all do. It's sort of one of those checkbox things that I kind of have programmed in. I would argue that 100% of my patients make a change to their diet. How many go all the way? Probably 10 or 15%. But if I, keep pushing on them year after year after year, the numbers keep going up. But I would tell you my favorite thing, and this happened literally last week, one of my pulmonary colleagues called me up and said, Andrew, I don't know what you did to this patient, but they're off their oxygen, they dropped 30 pounds, and they feel the best they've ever felt. How did you do that? And I said, the same way I always do it, right? I take good care of them, do what I have to do from a standard approach, and then get them to change their lifestyle. And he's like, my goodness, I am an absolute believer, and thank you for seeing this guy. And I love that. So that is very reinforcing. Nothing makes me excited as a healer, as a physician, to actually see people get better, right? When I throw meds at people, yeah, they feel better maybe, or their numbers improve, but they're stuck on a med. The med is doing a lot of the work, and I want them to do a lot of the work.
Right. No, absolutely. Well, share about your family. How does your family eat at home and exercise, and how do you bring that in?
Yeah, so at least for me personally, I try to get in every day at least 30 minutes of formal exercise, which means I get up early before work, and I either get on the Peloton bike or I do like a high intensity fitness class with weights, all those things that I think are important, and I think that's critical. My wife does the same. She squeezes it in somewhere through the day. My kids and my wife in general are predominantly plant-based, although it is extremely hard for kids to be fully plant-based, only because they're exposed to a bunch of things at school, right? If someone has a birthday or someone brings in pizza. But I would tell you that, when given the opportunity, they reach for plant-based foods. One of my sons, his favorite snack is chickpeas, right out of the can. And so he'll eat those, and, we always keep those on hand. Or one of my sons loves edamame or soybeans. So we pop those in the microwave, and that's what he'll eat. And I think my kids overall really delight in eating plant-based foods, and they really don't ever really want, and I've never restricted them. If they said, Dad, I want a cheeseburger, I'd let them try it, but they've never wanted it. They kind of understand where things are. And I think kids have an innate ability to really understand things better than adults. And the greatest example is my nearly 10-year-old. When he was 4, we went to this farm where you could kind of watch things grow and see animals and pet them and all that. And he saw a turkey run around, and then he saw a chicken run around. He says, Dad, that chicken is really cool, but where do all those dead chickens come from that people are eating? Like he at 4. And I said to him, well, sadly, these dead chickens come from these live chickens, and you don't have to eat that if you don't want to. And I think ever since then, it's kind of grossed them out, to tell you the truth. So they don't really eat that way. So they may get a little dairy, maybe a little egg, and maybe on a very rare occasion, they might get some fish if they go to a family's house. But by and large, they're 95% plant-based.
But in your house, it's all plant-based.
Yes, for the most part. I mean, sometimes we have, guests or whatever that bring in something, but yeah.
Right. And how can you tell the audience, how do they get started with this? What do you tell your patients?
Yeah. So, first, there are sort of 2 ways people are wired, right? Some people are wired in a stepwise approach where they need to make small changes over time. But I think that the vast majority of us, and it's possible that all of us are wired where if we make big changes first, the results are much easier, which is why when people go paleo or Atkins or low carb, they cut out all this stuff at once and they seem to drop weight because they cut out all the garbage. And I think the same thing is probably true with humans. But bottom line is, first, I want to get them inspired about it, right? So I usually look for a hook, right? Do you want to be like every other American, work hard your whole life, save your money, get ready to retire, and look forward to heart attacks, dementia, stroke, erectile dysfunction, a really awful retirement? Or do you want to be dancing with your great grandkid at their wedding? And they all say, well, of course I want to be. Well, I said, okay, well, you're not on that path right now. Let's pivot a little. I'll say to them, do you want to get off your medicine? Do you want to see if we can get your weight down and maybe get your oxygen needs down, or whatever it may be? And then they all are very interested. So then I give them a packet of materials, which include a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. I ask them to watch some documentaries on Netflix, like Forks Over Knives and Eating You Alive and Game Changers and all those. And then I give them the transition to plant-based support group that I showed, or if they're sick enough to qualify, they'll get into intensive cardiac rehab. And every visit, we reinforce the same messages over and over again until they're there. But really, it takes somebody who's open-minded enough at any age. I mean, I've had people in their 80s do this who are willing to make these changes to get better. And the results are truly extraordinary. And I'm not just saying that. I mean, it is my favorite day to take people off of medicines in my clinic. I love to do that.
It's so great because my father lived with me the last 2.5 years of his life, and I changed him to a plant nutritious program, and everything he'd sit down, he's like, well, this is really good. Well, I like this, and I would laugh, but the change in him was so extraordinary in those 2 years. Started walking 45 minutes to an hour, the dementia just started going away and his mind became sharper, and it was just fun to watch because what you were just saying, it can happen at any age. I don't want the audience to think, well, I'm too old or I'm too this or I'm too that.
Right. Well, and it's definitely harder, right? If you're 75, you have 75 years worth of habits that I ask people to change. But I would also tell you that people are sick of being on meds. They're sick of feeling sick and they want to change. And so for those people, the results are truly extraordinary. I mean, I've had people with, debilitating arthritis say, Doc, I can open my hands again. Doc, I can throw a ball, or I can play with my dog, or whatever it may be. So I really want to encourage that your listeners here, that this approach is really powerful. And what I showed here was only the last year of data. So you can imagine that I put together a talk like this for the last, 7 or 8 years. And I have, 500 plus slides of studies that show time after time that a plant-based diet seems to be associated with far better outcomes. So there's definitely enough signal in whatever noise you may be hearing.
Yeah, and it takes, my thought is what you're saying all along, it takes your aha moment to make that change. And you're not ready until you're ready.
Well, that's exactly right. And I would tell you that when I discovered this, and I'll tell you my personal story, when I transitioned to being vegan, we were up in the mountains in Colorado in Steamboat on vacation. We ate at a greasy bar that had burgers. So I had my last cheeseburger. That night I finished, I think it was the China study. And the next day I was vegan, and I've been vegan ever since. So it was that aha moment, was like, my goodness, how on earth did I not know all of this? And it's really not mainstream, although it's becoming there. We published a study, the group that you've seen me publish with over the time, of 1,000 cardiologists. And it turns out that 90% of us know almost nothing about nutrition. So imagine that 90% of cardiologists out there, you're asking them, Doc, what should I eat to improve my risk of heart disease, and it turns out we know nothing.
Right.
Scary.
Well, and it's interesting too. A quick fact is, so my daughter and son-in-law, they saw the aha moment a different way, and they're scuba divers, and they went down and saw all the reef was white.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been preaching this forever, like yourself, you know, just sharing my passion. And they came back and said, okay, we changed. I said, what was it? And they said, the environment. So it doesn't matter how they get it.
Yeah, no, the truth is our environment is in great danger. And if we don't make some very big changes very soon, we're going to end up in huge trouble, right? So it's estimated by 2050 that our environment may not be as hospitable to us. There's a talk about vector-borne, you know, insect-borne diseases that will be spreading, like malaria, to places that have never had it before. You know, so there's a lot of bad things that are occurring that we need to make changes. So, you know, go solar if you can, consume less, recycle more. You know, it's amazing. I look even in Denver, you know, there is a huge divide amongst recyclers and non-recyclers, right? So, you know, we have 3 recycling bins and all of my neighbors have 1. And, you know, we're recycling virtually everything because the city does it and the neighbors don't. We have a compost bin. My neighbors aren't composting. You know, so there's just so many little things you can do every day that may not seem to matter, but they really do. And it's super important.
And also kids see as kids do as kids see. So if you bring this up in your family, your kids know no different. And that's my passion, which is the same as yours.
Right. And that's actually it, right? Do you want your kids or your grandkids or your nieces and nephews to grow up with blue skies and an ocean that is filled with fish and variety and the world as you knew it? Or do you want them to grow up having to wear masks and oxygen filters and all these awful things that may be coming? And I think the answer to that question is what I said first, right? So we need to make some changes. And some of the best things that we can make changes with in our life are the way we eat and live every day.
You're amazing. I'm so blessed you're in my life. Thank you so much. And everyone else's. Is there anything we missed that you'd like to share?
No, it's my pleasure. And I encourage the audience to check out a lot of these resources. And thanks for watching.
God bless.